What's going on, guys? Welcome back to WWE Network and Chill, where I, Graham Jason Matthews, break down all the original content I watch on the WWE Network. Today we're talking the latest episode of Broken Skull Sessions with Stone Cold Steve Austin and his very special guest, Ric Flair. This went up on Easter morning, April 12th, 2020. Had a chance to check it out yesterday, talking about it today. This was easily the longest episode yet, and it feels weird saying that when they've already had on Bret Hart and The Undertaker and Kane and all these other illustrious legends, Big Show, Goldberg, yet Ric Flair, I mean, no disrespect to Ric Flair, but this is a guy that Austin has already had on the podcast before, that being 4 or 5 years ago on the Stone Cold podcast. They've had a number of interviews before. I haven't seen that one in a while. I have never reviewed that one here for the channel, so I'd have to go back and check it out. I'm not really sure if they repeated any information here. This was great, don't get me wrong, but for Ric Flair, of all people, not even The Undertaker, who, you know, there's a lot of stuff he didn't get to in his interview with Stone Cold a couple of months ago. Seems strange to me, but the hour and I was going to say the hour and a half, not even the hour and 40 minutes blew by. I thought it was a very real interview. They talked a lot about old school wrestling, Ric Flair coming up, working with Dusty Rhodes, Harley Race, all these other people that I'll get to soon enough. So if you're not really into that type of thing, this interview may not be for you. But it was still, to me, really interesting nonetheless and very entertaining. A good old candid conversation between two old friends. So they kick off the interview with Ric Flair saying that moderation is a word that he's still learning to pronounce, in the sense that, you know, he's always had a lot of issues with drinking and stuff like that, and moderation has never really been his strong suit, but that's still something he's learning even at 70 years old. He talks about the health scare that he had a couple of years ago. I forgot exactly what it was. I think it might have been a heart-related issue, a heart attack or whatever. That was about 3 years ago, 3 years from August. He said that he could not remember anything, so he got better soon after, and it was in August. He was in the hospital for a while, for about, I think, a straight month or so. But he said he couldn't remember anything until February or March. How scary is that? Like, he lost all of his memory. He couldn't remember backward until February or March, which is months later, which is crazy. Stone Cold says flat out he considers Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, to be the greatest of all time. Ric Flair even admitted he hated going home prior to having kids. He hated to go home because he would only be home for about a day or so. And then when he was home, he would have to deal with his wife and all these other things. You couldn't get things resolved in a day. So why even bother going home at all? He would sometimes check into the next hotel a day early just to avoid going home to hearing complaining and stuff like that from his wife and whatever. And in some cases, I'm sure rightfully so, Ric Flair wasn't the most at-home guy when he was, growing up in the business, or, coming up in the business. He was always on the road with the women, drinking, all this other stuff. He wasn't really there for his kids, so I can understand the wife probably getting frustrated. But he never wanted to deal with it, so he was never really home until he had kids, and he loved to be home with those kids. So anyway, he talked about now, he gets restless at home. He was restless at home. Now he is. I mean, I think this was obviously recorded before the whole pandemic. But he talks about how he's thankful for his wife, Wendy, and how she's there for him, and, she kind of gets him and all that other stuff. He does admit if he has one regret, it's that he wishes he could have invested more time with his kids, which is a given. He wasn't there for, a lot. If you watch the Ric Flair 30 for 30, which I think is already aired by this point on ESPN, I know they replayed it last week. I really wish I recorded it because it was great stuff. But he talks a lot in that documentary about not being there for his kids when they were growing up. He said that being let go by Bischoff early on in his WCW run in the 90s, and then, I don't know if it was the same stint, but that time when he was let go by Bischoff, probably at some point in the 90s, and then again when WCW went under in 2001, because I remember he wasn't let go before that because he was on the last Nitro broadcast with Sting. So that period from when WCW closed down, before he went to WWE later that year, he called it the best days of his life, being home, hanging out with the kids, his wife, whatever. He said it was absolutely amazing. He said that he bought new clothes as he traveled, which is hilarious because Stone Cold was like, oh, what did you do on the road? He's like, I would buy new clothes as I traveled because I modeled myself after Nature Boy Buddy Rogers, the original Nature Boy. He talks, there's a lot of stories that he shares. I won't get into the exact details because we'd be here forever. I'll just kind of share the generals, I guess, so to speak, of each of these stories. And again, I didn't take specific notes on this thing, and I still ended up with over a page and a half of notes, because that's how long this conversation went and how much stuff they talked about. But he talked about teaming with Johnny Valentine against Wahoo McDaniel, two legends. He talks about taking that signature bump off the top rope and how he gave up to Shawn Michaels, actually, at WrestleMania 24 in his retirement match. Every bump that Ric Flair used to take, Shawn Michaels took in their match at Mania, which is kind of cool. Stone Cold brings up how Ric Flair is revered by rappers today. He's kind of woven into the fabric of modern day culture, which WWE claimed to be when they were like, oh, wrestling is a part of the modern day culture, when it really isn't. But Ric Flair absolutely is. His name is actually brought up quite often, quite frequently, if I do say so myself. And a lot of these rap songs, everyone know who Ric fucking Flair is, LeBron James, I guess he was the one who credited Ric Flair for keeping him out of trouble growing up. He called him the innovator of swag, and I guess LeBron James has always been a big Ric Flair fan, which is funny, saying that Ric Flair was the reason that he stayed out of trouble growing up when Ric Flair was always in trouble when he was in the wrestling business. I thought that was kind of funny. He said, it's time to quit when you can't be that person anymore. I mean, for him, of all people to say that is really telling, because the guy was wrestling up until his 60s in TNA, and even in WWE. I mean, the guy retired at, 50-something in 2008? I mean, come on. He probably knows more about that than anyone, but he really should have retired years before he actually did, when he was still at his peak, or at least close to it, not like a worn down, beaten down shell of his former self. Nonetheless, though, he said that he went through a period where he lost a lot of his self-confidence, which was the big theme on this episode. They kind of get back to that later. He mentions it here. They get back to it later on in the interview. He said he was able to do blood in his matches whenever he wanted to. Whenever he thought it was necessary, he would pop himself open. I'm sure that went for his WWE days as well, because he got busted open a lot in WWE. Not just in the NWA and WCW, but definitely in WWE as well. Even later on in his career, as he was winding down, he has this criticism of the modern-day wrestling industry, which I honestly completely agree with. There's a lot of things that Ric Flair says that probably aren't the smartest. Like, I think he said a couple years ago, oh, Finn Balor, a cruiserweight, should never main event WrestleMania, which is fucking bullshit. But he did say here he does not think everyone is great. Everyone is really, really good. There's a lot of good wrestlers out there. There's a lot of good performers, but not everyone can be great. It's like saying everything is amazing or awesome. Like, I think we kind of lost meaning of what that word means, We kind of lost sight of what that word means. And Ric Flair agrees with that when it comes to not everyone being great. He calls Stone Cold Steve Austin the biggest box office to ever happen to the wrestling industry. He names Hogan for also making a ton of money, but he also does not consider him a great worker, which it's not him, throwing shit at Hogan. He said even Hogan would agree with that, and he's right. Hogan was never a great worker. Maybe in certain respects, and he had a lot of classic matches, but in terms of, on the level of Ric Flair, it's not even close, He does call Undertaker both a great worker and that he drew a ton throughout his entire career. He said that Harley Race was a great worker, but he's never going to get the recognition he deserves because times have changed, which, again, I completely agree with him on. It's just a different time. In 2020, oh, this guy's great, that guy's great, this guy who opened up this indie show is great, everybody's great. But at the same time, though, there were a lot of great workers back in the day, but because the exposure wasn't what it is today, a lot of people will never get that recognition, which I completely agree with. He believes that throughout his entire career, even at 71 years old now, he has remained relevant. He loved being in Jim Crockett Promotions. He says that he had to learn how to work with everyone, regardless of their style. And he did call his second world championship reign his best. I guess he said he doesn't know, I don't know if this is a shoot or not, but he said he does not know how many actual world championships he's won. Because WWE's number is 16, but I think he won a lot more than that. But I guess the second world championship reign was the one that kicked off with the Flair for the gold, beating Dusty Rhodes to the championship. I believe it was either Dusty or Harley Race back at Starrcade 1983. I actually reviewed the pay-per-view here. My memory is absolute shit right now, but that was the whole Flair for the gold storyline. Kicked it off at Starrcade, became the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion. He said that was his best. He said that being a champion is a learning process. He praises Bobby Eaton as being very, very good, as does Stone Cold Steve Austin. He said that later on in his WCW run, that the tide would turn in WWE's favor because of how poorly things were being run in WCW towards the end during the Monday Night Wars. He does talk his Starrcade 1993 match, not 83, but 93 match with Vader. And he said that Harley actually whispered to him after he took a bump for Vader. Harley actually whispered to Flair, listen, you're embarrassing yourself. And he didn't really feel like he was the Flair of old at that point, and he really felt like he hit his peak in the late 80s, and then it was all downhill from there, he believes. But he also brings up how Harley was the one who called their early matches and Flair called their later matches, and Harley trusted him because of how well they worked together later on in their career. And I guess Harley had said that about Flair in that Vader match, and that was really what motivated him to get back to being the Ric Flair of old, because he was really just phoning it in. He wasn't the Ric Flair that people knew and loved, But he said that he calls himself one of the final last 3 traveling champions left. They praise Ricky Steamboat. I forgot who the other 2 traveling champions were, I believe, because Harley Race has since passed away. A lot of people have. I think he names Dory or Terry Funk, probably Dory and then someone else. But he's one remaining of a dying breed, he brings up. He said that, I'm sorry, I wrote down here one of the best baby faces. I thought he was talking about himself. He was actually talking about Ricky Steamboat. He calls Ricky Steamboat one of the best baby faces ever, right up there with Shawn Michaels, he said. And he said that Steamboat and Jack Briscoe were 2 people who could never be heels. Absolutely could never be heels. But he was a guy, although he was a babyface and many times during his career, he was a guy that was a horrible babyface. He could never really be a babyface. People loved him. He had the woo thing. He says it was because of his limited moveset. I have not seen enough Ric Flair matches to really judge that. If he's called the greatest worker of all time, how limited is his moveset really? He even said that he hated when Sting attempted to go heel because he's another guy that was just a natural babyface, even when he was doing the Crow Sting character in WCW later on. I love this. Oh, well, even before we get to the super kick thing, he said that the 2 people who always hated taking his chops, and I think this clip made the rounds online on Easter on WWE's YouTube channel, were The Undertaker and Bret Hart. They would count how many times or how many chops he would have to do in a match because they just stung so bad they hated frickin' taking that move. He said that he got the figure 4 leg lock from Jack Briscoe. So this is where he brings up how he hates that moves that were once finishers, moves like the superplex or like a suplex from Harley Race or whatever, have become just ordinary things. And not just, like a DDT is a common criticism, a superplex or a suplex rather, becoming a regular move. I kind of figured that doesn't really bother me. But like the super kick, I think we can all agree has been so watered down due to the modern day wrestling style. And not just in WWE, that goes for AEW, Ring of Honor, Impact, indie scene, everywhere. Literally everywhere. Everyone hits a goddamn super kick. And he freaking hates that. He says less is more. And he also praises Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker from WrestleMania 25 as the best he's ever seen, as one of the best matches he has ever seen. He talks about facing Andre the Giant on 3 different occasions, one-on-one, which I never knew. I thought that was really interesting. Let's see, where else was I in my notes here? Oh, he said that every crowd is different. He goes on this kind of spiel about different things and talks about Andre for a while. But he says you don't really know a crowd until you get out in front of them and kind of feel the crowd, get a feel for what they're, what they want and what they want to see and stuff like that, Austin reveals that he actually modeled himself early on when he was, had the blonde hair in WCW, that he modeled his career after Ric Flair. They then relive and rewatch the 1992 Royal Rumble, which is widely regarded, and rightfully so, as one of the greatest Royal Rumbles of all time. He said that he was like 42, 43 at the time, which is nuts. I guess that's not really all that crazy considering like AJ Styles, Bobby Roode, Nakamura, I believe are all in their 40s now. And if any one of them won the Royal Rumble tomorrow, except for maybe Bobby Roode, who's been really watered down in recent years by WWE's booking, I think I would be okay with that. It seems old now, considering there's a lot of young guys. Like, for example, Austin Theory is like 22 years old. Ric Flair or AJ Styles is literally 20 years older than Austin Theory. That's unbelievable to me. Rhea Ripley, too, she's only 23. AJ is what, 41, 40 maybe? That's crazy to me. And he said that the match worked because everybody was over at that point, which I completely agree with. Everyone was over. And it's not like the Attitude Era. That was another situation where everyone was over, which is why everything worked so well for the most part. This is 1992, He said that he drank a bunch of martinis after that post-match promo, which is, again, really, fondly looked back on as being one of the greatest, which it is. It's a very good post-match promo. With a tear in my eye. And he said he didn't really know what he meant by that tear in his eye line. He just knew that he was the best at that time. They didn't have to rehearse it at all. He didn't really have to rehearse any of his lines. He had no self-confidence prior to first getting to WWE. And I guess later on in the 90s, later on in that decade, he had self-confidence issues. They praised Kerry Von Erich as being a phenomenal athlete, and Ric Flair had a bunch of matches with him. Ric Flair says that 3 people that were always over were Stone Cold Steve Austin, Kerry Von Erich, and Hulk Hogan. He said that Dusty Rhodes and Ricky Morton were also among the most wrestlers that he ever faced, the most over wrestlers he ever faced, which is kind of crazy. I wouldn't think of Ricky Morton, but they show, not footage, but like they show pictures and they talk about how Ricky Morton, in one match that Flair had with him, was just going, like the crowd was going crazy. All the girls, everyone was going nuts for Ricky Morton. And Flair said after Stone Cold brings up why did not Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair not happen at WrestleMania 8 for the WWE Championship, he said, I don't know. I do not know for a fact why that match did not happen. It could have been to a few different things, though. It could have been due to a few different issues that were going on at that time. Number one, he said it may have been a quote-unquote cash flow problem. What he means by that, I honestly don't really know. I'm not really sure what he was talking about. Maybe because the business or the company wasn't making much money at the time and they weren't going to make as much money for the match as they expected, so they scrapped it. I don't know. Another reason he speculates is that Hogan and Vince may not have been able to come to terms on the match, and the fact that Hogan didn't really want to drop the belt to Flair. Don't know. But he does say that in WWE that he had the best year and a half of his career ever. He had one of the best year and a halves ever in WWE facing, not Hulk Hogan, maybe on a dark match. I don't think they ever had a match in WWE, but he faced Randy Savage. They had great chemistry. Mr. Perfect towards the end of his run. A lot of people during that stretch of time that Ric Flair had really, really good chemistry with. Some of the best of all time. And then he goes on to talk about how he feels Sting doesn't also get enough credit for being as good as he is. And it's hard to go 50 minutes in the ring, he says, and that he was over big time at the time. They replay their match, I believe, from a Starrcade a few years later. No, I'm sorry, it was years earlier in the 80s, I think. How he was super over at the time, that he wrestled him a ton. And he said that he made a lot of bad choices himself, but, Sting's one of those people that he could talk to, and Austin as well, that they never have any issues. He's always happy to talk to him because they're not really letting the business pass them by or whatever. He said that Wendy was really what helped him become who he is today and a much better person. Wendy was the person who spent 31 days by his side in the hospital when he was hospitalized a couple of years ago. And it took him 63 years to find his wife, find the love of his life. And he says that he has $1 million right now. That's what he said, $1.5 million. He jokes about that, how he went bankrupt a couple times. He doesn't owe anyone any money anymore, which I guess is good. It's obviously a good thing, but he owed a lot of people a lot of money, was in a lot of debt many years before this. They then talk about, and I'm very happy they brought this up because this match, in my opinion, does not get enough credit, the Undertaker match from WrestleMania 18, Ric Flair versus The Undertaker. And he says simply, he made me, talking about Taker making him. He couldn't believe that Taker wanted to work with him. And he had a hard time fitting in, he said, when he first came back to the company in 2001, because he was so much older than everybody. Even The Undertaker, he was 20 years older than the guy, And he was never supposed to wrestle. He was only supposed to be an authority figure. Then he had the match with Vince at the Royal Rumble, and then he had the match with Taker at WrestleMania. Then he had to fill in for Stone Cold Steve Austin, actually, for that Brock Lesnar match that Austin no-showed and then left the company for in June of 2002. Ric Flair filled in for him there, and then he became a regular part of the roster after that because Austin no-showed the show. Stone Cold does say that he wishes that he and Flair could have crossed paths when they were both at their respective peaks. They both agree that The Undertaker has the greatest gimmick of all time. He said that walking to the ring for that WrestleMania match, he didn't even know if he still had it. And they relived the match. Stone Cold praises his wrestler physique, saying that he was great shape at the time. But Flair said, listen, I know I was 50-something, it was a decent physique, but I felt like a shell of my former self. And he gets emotional talking about how Vince got emotional, praising him before they wrestled at the Royal Rumble, saying that it would be an honor for him to face Ric Flair. It was a dream for Vince to face Ric Flair at the Rumble. Doesn't sound like something Vince would say, but it's because it's very heartfelt, and you don't really know Vince to be that way, but I believe it. And then he also gets emotional. Flair starts crying because you had to know it was going to happen at some point. It's not a Ric Flair podcast or an interview or a promo or whatever if he's not crying at some point. But he gets emotional talking about how people praise him and they idolize him, and he influenced a lot of careers. And that means a lot to him, which is really cool. He said that I don't know what battled it up and down until I'm sorry. So he dealt with the self-confidence a lot throughout his career. It went up and down up until he retired in 2008. He mentions the cage match with Triple H. He specifically says Taboo Tuesday 2005 as being a match that he really, really enjoyed, and being in there with someone like a Triple H who could remind him how great he actually is was really a great way for him to kind of get that self-confidence back and be the Ric Flair of old. They then transitioned into Evolution for a brief bit, saying that he was only ever supposed to manage Evolution, and sure enough, he ended up wrestling, winning the World Tag Team titles with Batista. He knows they will be inducted eventually into the WWE Hall of Fame as a group. He's very happy for Batista going into the Hall of Fame this year. Not sure when it's going to be at this point, but he's very happy for Batista going in now. He said that Evolution got Goldberg over, and I mean, he was kind of already over, but kind of actually, if anything, destroyed Goldberg, but that's another story for another day. Hoped get Goldberg over and a lot of other people over, specifically Batista and to an extent Orton as well. And they then talk about the Shawn Michaels-Ric Flair match from WrestleMania 24, and Michaels told Flair to follow him in their match, which a lot of people had never done before. So Shawn Michaels, basically, according to Flair, was having a match with himself. And he recalls the entire emotional retirement weekend from going into the Hall of Fame, retiring against Shawn Michaels the next night at WrestleMania, then having that amazing, phenomenal farewell on Raw the very next night. And at that point, as he's kind of soaking in the crowd after he retired, losing to Shawn Michaels at 24, and the crowd's just, going nuts for him, he said that he felt like the luckiest guy in the world, especially with his family there. Then Stone Cold asks him point blank, what happened with the TNA run? I love that they bring this stuff up. I mean, again, I'm not too surprised because Stone Cold brought this up with AJ Styles a couple of years ago, and they talked about TNA for quite a while, actually. But I'm very happy he brought up the TNA stint because, yes, he did retire in 2008, only to break that retirement. Yeah, he's still technically retired in WWE, but he broke his wrestling retirement, as anyone else does, 99% of performers do, when he wrestled in TNA. About a year or two later, not even actually, I think he had his first match back with the company in 2010. So yeah, about 2 years later in 2010. And he said, listen, Steve, I only did it for the money. And because I had fun there. He actually called it a lot of fun, which I thought was interesting. He didn't bury TNA like other people do. He said that he had fun there. There was a lot of people there that he enjoyed working with. People like, he knew Hogan, but more so Angle and Sting, people that he was always very familiar with. He said that he would get there at 3 for the tapings. He would be back at the bar by 7 because he wasn't really needed all that much. He got paid a lot of money to do very, very little. I mean, that's what he loved about being in TNA. But at the same time, he hated working for Bischoff. He said that he absolutely hated working under Bischoff, again, a lot like in WCW. And he apologized, he said, profusely, in his words, to Vince McMahon for doing that TNA run because he felt like he went back on his WWE retirement. He was back in WWE literally within 3 years. He left WWE, had his last appearance there in 2009, June of 2009. Left TNA by early 2012, was back in WWE at the Hall of Fame then in official capacity by December of 2012. So he really was not gone for that long. It felt like a while at the time, but he really was only gone for a few years. People are gone for a lot longer than that, But he never really had an exit strategy when he retired. He said that he was irresponsible. He is irresponsible, and his wife kind of takes care of him and keeps him in check. He wishes that he had a manager, and specifically like a social media manager years ago to kind of keep track of what he does and all this other stuff. And how, he idolizes Steve in that respect, that Steve has they talk about the brand and having a brand and the importance of having a brand and how, Stone Cold Steve Austin has had a handle on that for a very long time now. They talk briefly about the plane crash from early on in his career, his promo style, calls the 80s his favorite era of the business. Damn right. I'm not saying it's my favorite, but the 80s are a great decade, wrestling or otherwise, and I wasn't even around for him, but I got to agree. Calls Ted DiBiase one of the best workers, said that he had great matches with Barry Windham too, despite never really having a full-fledged feud with the guy. Said that Barry Windham, actually, both of them agree that Barry Windham belongs in the Hall of Fame by himself. And I believe he went in with the Four Horsemen back in 2012, but he deserves a solo induction, which I'm sure will never happen, but they said that he deserves it. His favorite program, though, was with Dusty Rhodes. Of course, it's got to be. Stone Cold shares a story about seeing Dusty Rhodes for the first time in person and how it really connected and resonated with him. He said that on the topic of the woo, where did it come from? He said that he listened to country music a lot growing up, and he got the woo from a song, I think the Great Balls of Fire song, the Jerry Lewis Great Balls of Fire song in 1974, around the time where his career started. He said seeing Charlotte Flair, his daughter, they talk about Charlotte because, of course, and why wouldn't they, Seeing Charlotte win the championship, the Divas title specifically, from Nikki Bella back in Night of Champions 2015 was one of the best moments of his life. And Charlotte is not really doing it for herself as much as she is for her brother. She didn't really grow up a wrestling fan, although she was involved in the business. She made a lot of appearances on WWE and WCW TV. But, she did it for her brother that passed away in early 2013, March of 2013. And says that he's better in the ring, or rather Charlotte's better in the ring than he ever was. And it's tough for second-generational talents to kind of, not get over, but they face a lot of pressure, and she's handled it well. He also says that Bray Wyatt's doing a phenomenal job with his character, that he's more so character work, but he's a great worker too, he says, which is high praise coming from coming from Ric Flair about Bray Wyatt. Stone Cold says that her career stands on its own. And they also talk about how Ric Flair's legacy means a lot to Rick and how he thinks about his legacy a lot and how does he want to be remembered, he's asked. He said that he wants to be remembered for the good and not the bad, which, I guess obviously everyone says, and that doesn't exactly work out that way, but there is a lot of good aspects about Ric Flair more so than the bad, so I gotta agree with him there in terms of the good, I believe, outweighs the bad. He wishes that he could have been around more as a father, and he influenced a lot of people, he admits, growing up in the wrestling business, and a lot of people look up to him as their favorite wrestler, and understandably so, I would say. He got the sunglasses for his character from Superstar Billy Graham, which I never knew. And he said that when he eventually passes away and moves on or whatever, that he hopes the positives outweigh the negatives. And then to close it out, I'm not really sure what purpose this served, because it wasn't like he was retiring or anything, but they showed footage from after a Raw in May of 2003. I forgot where it was from, but Vince McMahon came out and hugged Rick. Stone Cold was having a beer bash with the guy. The entire roster was out in the ring with him, and then they ended the episode right after that, after a swig of beer from the working man, or for the working man, rather. So I don't really know why they showed that footage, aside from just showing the friendship, the long-standing friendship and history between Stone Cold and Rick. Because, again, it was from, I believe, May of 2003. So it wasn't like he retired, like it was the farewell that he had in March or April of 2008 on Raw. Not really sure why they showed it, but it was cool footage nonetheless. And that does it for the Broken Skull Sessions episode with Ric Flair. Great stuff again. It's a long watch. One of the longer pieces of content you'll watch on the WWE Network, That's not a pay-per-view or whatever, or a documentary, full-on documentary. It's an hour and 40 minutes, which is a lot of time to ask for an interview. When you have Ric fucking Flair on there, you kind of have to expect it. One of the greatest, if not the greatest of all time. So it makes a lot of sense. But check it out right now on the WWE Network. Thank you guys for checking out my review of the episode. Thoroughly appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, drop a comment, share the video, and subscribe to the channel for more content. Coming up this week, a ton of reviews for Dark Side of the Ring, hashtag AskGSM, Wrestle Rant Radio excerpts, Total Bellas, SmackDown reviews, and so much more. And also, by the way, cheap plug, check out my exclusive interview with WWE Hall of Famer, All Elite Wrestling Zone, good old JR, Jim Ross, this week on Bleacher Report, as well as on Wrestle Rant Radio this Thursday on iTunes, Podbean, Stitcher, Spotify, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Google Play, NextTheWrestling.net, everywhere where you can find your favorite podcast, including Wrestle Rant Radio. So until next time, guys, shameless plugs aside, I'm Graham GSM Matthews, and I'll catch your ass down the road.